mission of the West Michigan Veterans Coalition is helping veterans and their family members in the community. We want to support those who have earned it, as each of them wrote a blank check with their lives to the United States of America.
Funds from the coalition have gone directly towards employment, scholarships, temporary housing, and gaps that exist when the need falls outside of government and private organizations. Much of this work is made possible through the support of events like the Armed Forces Thanksgiving.
With the loyal support of our sponsors, the event has been able to gift $250,000 to the West Michigan Veterans Coalition.
The event's mission is to provide a community salute to our military past, present, and future, and we are thrilled to be able to give back to our local heroes.
Through this partnership, a large portion of these donations have funded 50 scholarships to veterans and their dependents, which have been used at four-year colleges, community colleges, and for vocational training.
5 veterans attending programs sponsored by the Boulder Crest Foundation to heal, train, and deal with their traumatic experiences. Over 250 veterans being prepared for meaningful, career-oriented jobs in the civilian sector.
And in just the last year, over 200 West Michigan veterans have received financial help for food assistance, car repairs, home repairs, rent assistance, temporary lodging, and psychological counseling.
We are thrilled that the event has provided the resources to give back to the local veteran community, and we look forward to sharing their stories within the community.
Get involved today with the West Michigan Veterans Coalition or the Armed Forces Thanksgiving if you are interested in supporting veterans in West Michigan. Simply visit the websites listed below.
First of all, I would like to thank our sponsors for the support of this program and others like it. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to mention that we will be having a question and answers with your questions at the end of the program. And you can use the Zoom chat feature or the Q&A feature to pose your questions, and I will do my best to include as many as possible. Now on to the introduction. Today's esteemed lecturer was educated at Winchester and Sandhurst, where he studied military history under the legendary historian John Keegan. A regular officer with the 11th Hussars, he left the Army after 5 years to begin writing. His work has appeared in 35 foreign languages and sold more than 8 million copies, and he is the best-selling historian of the modern era. Some of his books include The British Army, Crete, The Battle and the Resistance, which was awarded the Rumkian Prize, Paris after the Liberation, and The Battle for Spain, 1936 to 1939. Stalingrad, first published in 1998, won the first Samuel Johnson Prize, the Wolfson Prize for History, and the Hawthorne Prize for Literature in 1999. In 2002, he published Berlin, The Downfall, 1945, which is another #1 bestseller in 7 countries and a top 5 in another 9 countries. The book received the first Longman History Today Trustees Award. In 2005, he published A Writer at War, Vasily Grossman with the Red Army, 1941 to 1945. His D-Day, The Battle for Normandy, published in 2009, was a #1 bestseller in 7 countries and a top 10 in another 8, which was followed by the Second World War in 2012 and the Ardennes 1944, Hitler's Last Gamble in 2015. His latest book, Arnhem, The Battle for the Bridges, published in 2018, was another international bestseller. Antony Beevor was made a Chevalier by the French government in 1997, and in 2008 was awarded the Order of the Cross of the Terra Mariana by President of Estonia. In 2015, he was made the Commander of the Order of the Crown by the Belgian government for his book on the Ardennes, and he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in 1999 and the Royal Historical Society in 2017. He has been a visiting professor at Birkbeck College, University of London, and is also a visiting professor at the University of Kent. He is an honorary fellow of King's College London and has also received honorary degrees of doctor and letters from the Universities of Kent, Bath, East Anglia, and York. In 2014, he received the Pritzker Literature Award for Lifetime Achievement in Military Writing, and in 2016, the Norton Medlicott Medal for Service to History. He was awarded his knighthood in 2017, the New Year's Honors List. He is currently working on a history of the Russian Civil War, which is due out this summer. I take immense pride in welcoming Sir Antony Beevor to the digital stage.
Right, okay, there we are, sorry. Joe, thank you very much indeed. You're welcome. The Second World War was a war like no other, and yet it has come to define our idea of war itself. Politicians and the mass media alike still cannot resist the temptation to dramatize the importance of particular crises by making comparisons to the Second World War. So at a time when we're witnessing the first major continental war in Europe since 1945, it's surely a good time to re-examine both its characteristics and its consequences. More than any other war in history, it was dominated in the age of totalitarianism by major figures. This established even more firmly in the popular imagination the idea of the great man theory of history. I often find myself being asked why there are no great leaders today. A very brief answer to that is that the globalized economic system greatly restricts the freedom of action of political leaders, and all too often media considerations strongly influence their decision-making, which was not the case in the past. So in the Second World War, the characters of leaders determined the course of events in a way we have not seen since then and thought we would never see again. That is, until Putin decided to defy world opinion in his onslaught on Ukraine. Recently, the Munich Agreement of 1938 has been much discussed because of superficial parallels with the events leading up to the war on Ukraine and the utter failure of diplomacy to prevent it. Ironically, in the circumstances, Putin has tried in the past to blame Britain and France for failing to stand up to Hitler in September 1938. He asserts that this was what forced Stalin to make the Nazi-Soviet pact. He makes no mention of Stalin's paranoid purge of the Red Army, which weakened it so disastrously just as the threat of war increased. But when it comes to the limits of diplomacy, the answer is you cannot possibly avoid a war if you have an obsessive dictator, such as Hitler or Putin, who have a powerful army and are determined to use it against a much weaker neighbor. The most revealing aspect is that Hitler complained bitterly in private after Chamberlain caved in, because he had really wanted a war against Czechoslovakia. I once asked a very distinguished psychiatrist who was fascinated by the Second World War how he would define Hitler and Stalin. After making the usual qualifications about the dangers of analyzing people you have not met, he replied that Stalin was almost certainly a paranoid schizophrenic. But in the case of Hitler, all you could say was that he had a personality disorder. I didn't feel that I'd advanced much further as far as the Führer was concerned. The paradoxes in our attitudes to the subject of the Second World War are striking. The conflict brought world history together for the first time, partly because of its global reach, but also because it accelerated the end of colonialism in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. And yet, despite its overwhelmingly international character, every country involved tended to cling to its own national narrative of the great conflict. Many cannot agree on when the Second World War began. Each country has its own historical version of events because experiences and memories of it are so different. For Americans, the war started in December 1941 with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration of war on the United States a few days later. Most Europeans assume that it commenced with Hitler's assault on Poland. Putin, meanwhile, insists that it only began in June 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. He angrily tries to whitewash Stalin's own invasion of Poland in September 1939 under the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet pact. Yet for the Chinese, the Second World War started in 1937 with the Sino-Japanese War. and many on the left in Spain are still convinced that it began in 1936 with General Franco's nationalist rising to overthrow the Spanish Republic. The Spanish right, on the other hand, argue that the Spanish Civil War was in fact the opening round of World War III against communism. A number of historians extend the conflict even further, arguing over what is called the Long War of the 20th century. Some say it lasted from 1914 to 1945. Others prolong the period until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, seeing it as an international civil war more than a conventional state-on-state war, different conflicts. These were conditioned by both big power rivalry, ethnic disputes following the redrawing of frontiers in the Versailles Conference, and those elements of an international civil war from the polarizing clash between fascism and communism. The simplistic portrayal of it as a titanic struggle between democracy and dictatorship never bears scrutiny, especially with a totalitarian Soviet Union so prominent among the victors. Today, in an era of acute respect for human rights in the West, it is very hard to appreciate the huge historical forces which killed some 60 to 70 million people. When we dwell on the enormity of the Second World War and its victims, we try and fail to absorb the reality of all of those statistics of national and ethnic tragedy. The Poles lost nearly 6 million people, almost a fifth of their population. The Chinese lost more than 20 million. Estimates of total Soviet losses range from 24 to 26 million dead. Stalin knew in 1945 that they exceeded 20 million, but he tried to conceal this. As David Reynolds, the professor of international relations at Cambridge University, pointed out, he settled for 7.5 million as a figure that sounded suitably heroic, but not criminally homicidal. So less than a third of the true figure. The statistics of suffering and the sheer size of the numbers are dangerously numbing, as the great Russian writer Vasily Grossman instinctively understood. In his view, the duty of survivors was to try to recognize the millions of ghosts from the mass graves as individuals, not as nameless people in caricatured categories, because that sort of dehumanization was precisely what the perpetrators had sought to achieve. But focusing entirely on the dead makes us overlook the way the Second World War also totally changed or marked the whole life of survivors. Many aspects are not as they appear on the surface, as I've learned over the years. I remember as a young officer in Germany, based next to Belgium concentration camp, being horrified by a memorial there to the French Jews who had died. It stated, "Aux Juifs français qui sont morts pour la gloire et la patrie." I found the idea of French Jews dying for glory and the fatherland in Belgium quite grotesque. Many years later, I mentioned this to the French historian Henri Rousseau. He replied, "I entirely understand your reaction, but you're completely wrong. It was the French Jews themselves who insisted after the war that memorials to their dead should have exactly the same wording as those of all the French. This was because they would never forgive Vichy for having tried to take away their French citizenship." Some misunderstandings about the Second World War are perfectly innocent. Others are deliberate distortions of the truth. One of the unique aspects of the conflict is the subject should still be such a propaganda battleground 80 years later. On the 9th of May, Victory Day in Russia, we can once again expect Putin's argument that the Soviet Union won the Second World War single-handed. It is a vital element in his claim to patriotic legitimacy. He has even demanded a constitutional amendment on historical truth to protect the great achievement of the people in the defense of the motherland. This attitude is also a fundamental part of his complaint that Russia is a major world power but has not been taken seriously. But what is the truth? According to German sources, just over 4 million Wehrmacht fatal casualties took place on the Eastern Front, which amounted to about 3/4 of the total Wehrmacht death toll of 5.3 million deaths. This forms the core of the largely justified Russian claim that it was the Red Army which broke the back of the Wehrmacht and not the British or the Americans. Yet at the same time, Putin refuses to acknowledge the American and British contribution to Soviet survival and ultimate victory on the Eastern Front. He implicitly echoes the Soviet party line that the United States and Britain kept delaying the cross-channel invasion so that the Red Army would suffer the casualties and not their own men. Yet even Stalin acknowledged privately to Khrushchev that if the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. Marshal Zhukov, the most important Soviet commander, agreed. Along with the vast quantities of vehicles, aircraft, and steel came food supplies, which saved the Soviet Union from outright famine, especially in the winter of 1942 to 43. Red Army soldiers in their dugouts used to joke on opening a tin of American Spam. Let's open the second front. Few Russian historians, however, are prepared to acknowledge that the controversial Allied strategic bombing campaign against German cities also helped the Soviet Union enormously. Whatever one might think on moral grounds about these relentless bombing operations against mainly civilian targets, they certainly forced the Luftwaffe to withdraw the bulk of its fighter squadrons and anti-aircraft guns to defend the Reich. And this gave the Soviet Union air superiority on the Eastern Front. The 88mm anti-aircraft guns were the Germans' most effective anti-tank guns, so this also made a great difference in the ground war. The other important side effect of the Germans losing air superiority on the Eastern Front meant that they could not carry out air reconnaissance over the Red Army's rear areas. This enabled the Soviets to carry out major deception operations, which they call maskirovka, to conceal their major offenses, just such as Operation Bagration, a surprise attack which destroyed the Wehrmacht's Army Group Center in the summer of 1944. Finally, there is one irony which Russian historians still refuse to admit. If the United States had not provided nearly 500,000 military vehicles to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, then the US Army would have reached Berlin well before the Red Army. So Stalin, Khrushchev, and Zhukov were right, and Putin is wrong. The Soviet Union could never have defeated Hitler on its own. One of the great debates of recent years has been over the origins of the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union. Did it start in 1947 with the Clay-Robertson Agreement to revive West Germany and the announcement of the Marshall Plan for American aid to a war-devastated Europe? Did Stalin outmaneuver Churchill and Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference and then break his word over free and fair elections in Poland? Churchill was indeed far too optimistic, if not self-deluding. I have great hopes of this conference, he told the House of Commons before leaving, but it comes at a moment when a good many molds can be set out to receive a great deal of molten metal. Churchill was suffering from the heady illusion that the so-called Big Three could remake the international order on a stable footing. We had the world at our feet, 25 million men marching at our orders by land and sea. We seemed to be friends. But he was sadly disillusioned. Ever since its medieval origins, Russia had been paranoid about encirclement and consequently obsessed with occupying or controlling its neighbors in the near abroad. For Stalin, Poland was the key to Soviet security after the war, and he was determined that it should be kept entirely under his thumb. And for Putin, Ukraine represents the soft underbelly of Russia, as well as an integral part of ancient Rus. Stalin had suffered a traumatic shock and humiliation on the 22nd of June 1941, when the Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union without warning. His paranoid fear of surprise attack afterwards made him even more determined to create a cordon sanitaire of communist satellite states centered on Poland and East Germany to make sure that it could never happen again. This was the true cause of the Cold War, which lasted until 1989. As it happens, last December of 2021 saw the 30th anniversary of the actual collapse of the Soviet Union, which President Putin famously described as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. For him, the loss of Belarus and Ukraine was the cruelest stab. No country can escape the horrors and humiliations of their own history, least of all Russia and China. Putin longs to reverse the decline and fall of the Soviet Union by fair means or foul, so that Russia is treated as a great power again. Bizarrely, Putin blames the origins of the Ukraine crisis on Vladimir Lenin for allowing the former subject nations of the Tsarist empires to demand independence. This was because Lenin believed that its component nationalities would return to their subordinate position come the imminent world revolution. In fact, Putin is wrong. The process did not begin with Ukraine. It started in Finland more than a month before the Bolshevik coup d'etat in Petrograd. Mark Twain famously observed that history does not repeat itself, but it can produce echoes. Others have talked of history rhyming. We have now been hearing echoes from the 1930s. Both President Xi in China and Putin openly reject that rules-based international order and despise democracy, as we saw dictators do between the two world wars. At the same time, over recent years, we have recently experienced a disturbing lack of confidence and respect for democratic principles across Europe, around the world, and indeed also in the United States. Yet we have now just seen an extraordinary revival of cooperation between Western governments, both NATO members and the European Union, shocked and outraged into action at Putin's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. Whether this represents a major mood swing in the struggle between liberal values and authoritarianism, or signifies a major return to realpolitik, there can be little doubt that 2022 will be seen as one of the most significant dates of this century. Thank you very much.
Sir Antony, thank you very much for that extremely, I'm really, thank you very much for that. Now to get on to some questions that I prepared, as well as after mine, Gleaves Whitney, the executive director of the foundation, will ask a question, and then we'll move on to the audience questions. So please, if you have a question for Sir Antony, please put it in the Q&A, and hopefully we'll be able to get to it. On to my first question. Today, as you know, is International Women's Day. At the Gerald R. Ford Museum, we are celebrating Women's History Month and a special exhibit dedicated to women in uniform. Your book, The Second World War, in my view, is a masterpiece and perhaps the best single volume history of the conflict ever written. And I say this, of course, with very high deference to Sir Martin Gilbert and John Keegan. Of many things your book is noted for is its focus on the conditions and grief faced by women and civilians for much of its coverage of the war in East Asia and really across the whole spectrum of the conflict. And then this has been called, masterful by many reviewers. Could you please talk a little bit about how women served and suffered during the conflict?
Well, absolutely. But I think, first of all, the reason for this change of what used to be military history, and I think we owe a great deal, not obviously partly to John Keegan, but above all to Professor Sir Michael Howard, who argued very, very strongly that we should not be military historians because we're not just writing about the movement of armies and regiments and divisions or whatever. We should be historians of war, and that includes obviously civilians, women, children, everybody caught up in it. And this is actually one of the reasons why I think that the history of war has attracted so much attention recently, is because for once it's opened itself up to the interest of women and now to some excellent first-class women historians of war. And this, of course, has then brought in much more study of the role of women in war, both in uniform and as civilians. And it's certainly true, I think, that we had seen examples of women fighting in earlier periods, certainly in the Russian Civil War, or even in the Spanish Civil War. But really, it was in the Second World War that we really did start to see women not just in support roles, but actually taking part in a far more active way in operations, whether special operations in the resistance and in many other activities, flying aircraft, delivering aircraft. And now, of course, it is regarded as perfectly normal of women fighting alongside men. That had been held up for many, many years, usually out of a fear that the men would spend their time worrying about the women and their fate if they got captured by the enemy and not concentrate on the fighting. But that, I think, has been more or less disproved, if you like, as a male psychological quirk rather than a female problem. So we have seen an extraordinary evolution during the course of the 20th century. And no doubt we will see a much greater role in the future, particularly, I think, in fighter planes, the reactions of women there, and even in virtually all combat arms too.
Thank you. My next question is, let's talk about the war in the East and the correlations between 1941 and today, 2022. Can you share your knowledge of what happened to Kiev and Kharkov, now Kharkiv, in 1941?
Well, there were several battles of Kharkiv during the war. There was obviously the one in 1941, which was when Army Group South was sort of rampaging through Ukraine. And then there was the counterattack of the Russians just in 42, just as the Germans and Hitler were preparing Operation Blue, which was going to be the attack into the Caucasus. And then, of course, we get the third battle of Kharkov with the huge Russian counterattacks of 1943. So it's a city which has known much fighting and much destruction. And now it is facing total destruction under the artillery of Putin's army. The Russians have always been very proud of their artillery, and they used to refer to it as the god of war. The god of war is thundering again, they would say proudly. And of course, at the moment when everything else has ground to a halt, this is what they're doing. They're sitting back and they're using both their rockets and their tube artillery with absolute total lack of restriction on civilian targets.
I've noticed that many viewers of the conflict, and I see this repeatedly, what's going currently on in Ukraine are very perplexed by all the Russian vehicles, tanks, etc., stalled and sitting stuck in the mud. For our viewers who may not know what this is, can you explain the Rasputitsa and its historical significance?
Well, you know, people used to refer to General Winter as sort of one of the great advantages of the Russians, but they always tended to underestimate General Rasputitsa, which is basically the rainy seasons in the spring and autumn, where the mud was so thick. One can remember a sort of newsreel film of the Wehrmacht absolutely bogged down in the mud trying to get to Moscow in the autumn of 1941. And here in what we've seen in Ukraine is particularly on the route south in towards Kiev, where that large convoy was stuck. First of all, they were blocked by bled up bridges. I mean, the Ukrainians are extraordinarily resourceful and clever in what they did. Was that they blocked that road, and then they would do attacks from the side, and all of those armored vehicles which were there were completely stuck, and they couldn't go across country because of the mud. So they were sitting ducks. I'm surprised we didn't read more about the drones, which they'd acquired from Turkey, because they would have been ideal in those conditions. I'm sure there were some drone attacks or whatever, but as I say, I'm surprised we haven't heard more. But that actually is, anyway, the basis of Rasputitsa as an advantage to the Russians in, say, 1941, but a huge disadvantage in 2022.
Yeah, it's amazing that the Russian army didn't understand what it would mean to attack during this time.
It's
really
unbelievable the lessons. You're absolutely right, Joel. I mean, it's unbelievable the lessons they've forgotten, like sending in tanks unsupported by infantry right at the beginning.
Yeah.
You know, you'd have thought that what they learned in Stalingrad would have filtered down through the military academies and all the rest of it and been remembered.
Completely agree. I don't know how many of our friends at the Eisenhower Library are watching this, but I think that they will like this next question. You are not really a fan of General Montgomery. Actually, you've called him overrated, but you give high praise to General Eisenhower. What is the distinction you place between the two, and what sets them apart?
Judgment, simple as that. Eisenhower had judgment, and on the whole, Montgomery did not. He was totally self-obsessed. I mean, I did suggest, with a certain trepidation, I must admit, I did suggest that Monty was actually a high-functioning Asperger's. And interestingly, suddenly the BBC got me to have a live debate with Monty's step-grandson, who'd lived with Monty. And to my huge relief, he said, well, actually, I think this is the best explanation I've ever heard of Monty's inability to communicate with other people or see anything from anybody else's point of view but his own. So I can tell you that was a relief. But yes, it was. He was so self-obsessed. It was astonishing. And I think that all of his criticism about Monty, nice chap, no general, all that sort of dismissive attacks, and his sort of undermining of his own commander-in-chief was outrageous, and he should have been sacked. But the trouble was that the British had very few hero generals in the Second World War. We did actually have one or two, like, for example, Slim in Burma. But the trouble was that, having had a bit of a inferiority complex because of all of our defeats in the early part of the war, once Monty won Alamein, there was no stopping him. I'm afraid there was no stopping the British press. And the British press played a very bad part in all of that, in a sort of desperate attempt to boost our morale and ego. All they could do really was to sort of attack Eisenhower or undermine Eisenhower and trying to boost Monty. And Monty, I think, did more to wreck Anglo-American relations in that period and the immediate post-war period than anybody else.
So a lot of people saw this and saw our advertisement for this lecture, and we included someone who I simply don't think many Americans really know about, and that is the Ukrainian writer. You had mentioned him earlier, Vasily Grossman. Could you speak a little bit about who he is and why he is an important figure?
Vasily Grossman was born in Berdichev and was a Jewish, Russian, Jewish, Ukrainian writer. He didn't think of himself really as Ukrainian at all. He thought of himself much more, he was of the Russian-speaking minority. He didn't actually think of himself as really very Jewish to begin with. It was only when the war started that he really started to re-identify as Jewish. And with Ilya Ehrenberg, he was part of the anti-fascist committee, which of course was hated by Stalin. One has to remember whether or not Stalin was, I mean, I think Stalin was basically anti-Semitic, but the whole point was that Stalin would not allow the idea of the Jews as a special category of suffering. As far as he was concerned, all of the Soviet dead were Soviet citizens. And therefore, there was to be no acknowledgement of the Jews or of their suffering role in the Second World War. And Grossman, and the importance of Grossman was that he was a novelist who then became, during the war correspondent who spent most time at the front, especially in Stalingrad itself. And he was actually worshipped by Red Army soldiers because he was the only war correspondent who had the courage, and it was incredible moral courage as well as physical courage of spending time at the front, to actually describe things as they really were. Of course, he was hated and distrusted by Stalin, and was even sort of pushed away, for example, when it came to the victory at Stalingrad. He wasn't allowed to be present because they didn't want him to get any of that sort of glory. But he wrote the most important book of the Second World War, in my view, which was Life and Fate, which I think is still to this day regarded as certainly the most, it was intentionally the War and Peace of the Second World War and of the Stalinist era. And that was confiscated. Grossman never saw it published. It was taken by KGB. They even confiscated the typewriter ribbons to make sure that this book would be completely destroyed. But what they didn't know was that one spare copy had been passed to a friend of Grossman's and was hidden in, not deliberately, it happened to be just in a satchel out in a dacha. And then this was then microfilmed by Andrei Sakharov, the great scientist, and dissident, and smuggled out to the West, and that's how the book survived. And as I say, I think it is acknowledged as probably the greatest novel of the Second World War.
Thank you for that question. Gleaves, over to you for your question.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I have to ask a question on behalf of Colonel Ralph Howenstein, who here in West Michigan is beloved as a World War II veteran, a hero, a friend to so many here in the United States and abroad. Colonel Howenstein was the chief of intelligence under Eisenhower. So he would have, I think he would have liked the way you fielded the previous question. My question has to do with the whole issue of spycraft and who were the best spies. You know, here in the West, we learn about Bletchley Park and we learn about Enigma and Ultra as the effort on Schaeff and Italza's part to understand what was going on behind enemy lines. And Ralph in particular, since this is International Women's Day, I would just point out that Ralph in particular was proud of the fact that he did not lose one woman spy, only the men, unfortunately, which gave him great grief, but he was very proud of the fact that not one woman had died from his orders. I was wondering, Sir Antony, if you could just speak a little bit to the spying, the spycraft on the Eastern Front. We don't hear much about that.
It's certainly true that the West had a very effective system with Ultra and all the rest of it. Yes, women SOE operatives were definitely lost, but that was usually because the circuits they were working with in France were betrayed, and of course they were involved in that particular betrayal. That wasn't necessarily a question that they were lost by bad operations in London. On the other hand, London was responsible for one or two major disasters, particularly in Holland, in the Netherlands, when the other managed to basically break the whole of the SOE system of sending agents in, and that was an utter disaster. As far as the Eastern Front was concerned, the whole system was more or less run basically by the NKVD under Beria, using the partisans both for fighting and for intelligence. On the whole, the British and the Americans tended to separate the two between combat operations and intelligence, but that, of course, became slightly blurred at times. The point was, though, that the Soviets were unbelievably ruthless in their use of operations. I think the most shocking example, if you like, of ruthlessness came just before the Battle of Stalingrad, when with Operation Monastery, the NKVD special task under General Sudoplatov was ordered to get one of their agents, who was a sort of double agent, to pass to the Germans all of the details of the attack. Now, this was the diversionary attack in Army Group Center to pin down the German Army Group Center just before the Battle of Stalingrad. This was because they did not want to have the South reinforced. And so they handed over the details of the attack to the enemy and deprived them more or less of artillery support. And their losses of around 250,000 men was the equivalent of all of the British and American losses in the whole of D-Day and the Battle of Normandy, purely as a diversion, which, I mean, beggars belief. I mean, I don't think that any Western government would ever dare to go in for a sacrifice of that sort of order. Stalin also was completely paranoid about intelligence, and he wouldn't believe any of the intelligence warning him about the invasion in 1941. He didn't even trust Richard Sorga, their chief spy and brilliant operator in Japan. And it was only when they got signals intelligence confirming what he was saying about the attack south into the Pacific by the Japanese, rather than the fact that they were going to attack Siberia, did he really start to move the Siberian divisions up to the reinforcement of Moscow in the winter of 1941. So altogether, I think it goes back to the whole problem of confirmation bias. Stalin often disregarded brilliant intelligence because it didn't fit in with his own ideas. Like, for example, the whole of the plan for Operation Blau to attack into the Caucasus. They captured all of the papers of the operational papers. And of course, because it didn't fit with Stalin's obsession that they were going to come for Moscow yet again in 1942. He refused to believe it and thought, well, then it must be a trick. It must be a plant. So I'm afraid to say Stalin was not very good at making use of the intelligence, however good the intelligence might be.
Thank you. Joe.
Thank you. And now we'll move to your questions. First one is by Mr. Mufri. Do you think the turning point of the war in Europe came in December 41 with the German failure to take Moscow, or Hitler's declaration of war on the United States, or maybe Stalingrad was the turning point?
Well, very interesting. I mean, one can have, when one talks about sort of turning points of the war, it's always rather a fascinating subject. I would actually argue the very first turning point, which was the point from which Hitler was unlikely to win the war, actually came in May 1940, the moment that Churchill refused any idea of negotiation when it looked as if the British army was going to be lost in Dunkirk. That was the only moment when I think Hitler could have won the war outright. But fortunately, that never came to it. Obviously, his decision to attack the Soviet Union could be argued as another turning point. But it is absolutely right that December 1941, with the combination both of the failure to get Moscow and, above all, the American entry into the war, was the geopolitical turning point of the war. There was no way that Hitler was actually going to win the war from that point onwards. Now, it didn't look that way because 1942 was a disastrous year with not just Pearl Harbor, but the loss of Singapore, all of the disasters that happened during all of that early period. And it wasn't really until Stalingrad became, if you like, the psychological turning point of the war, when everybody could see that the war was going to end and it would end in Berlin. And I'm never going to forget the description of a Russian colonel shouting at the German prisoners limping out of Stalingrad on frostbitten feet, pointing to the ruins around them, saying, "That is what Berlin is going to look like." And that was going to be the moment when actually the whole world recognized that the war was going to end in Berlin.
This next question comes from Ms. Drake. Considering the starvation inflicted upon Ukraine by Stalin in 32-33, and the fact that some Ukrainians did take up arms on the German side in 42, how do these events affect the attitudes in Ukraine and Russia that may persist today and affect the current situation between the two countries?
Well, I think it's important to understand that you're absolutely right. She's absolutely right about the Holodomor, the genocide famine, as the Ukrainians rightly call it. There was always a major problem, obviously, of anti-Semitism in Ukraine from Cossacks, from many peasants. But it was made worse because the communists passed a rumor to many that the famine was actually caused by the Jews, so as to divert attention away from the fact that it was actually the collapse of the collective farms and Stalin's deliberate policy of preventing grain being kept in Ukraine. That's why a number did welcome the Germans when they came. A minority, it must be emphasized. And also one must remember, of course, that the anti-Soviet feeling was such that it was actually Colonel Count von Clausewitz, the 20th July plotter, Stauffenberg, who on the up there was recommending that a Ukrainian army of 1 million should be raised to fight the Soviet Union and turn the invasion into a civil war. And he argued that actually that was the only way that they would have the manpower to hold down the vast landmass that they were occupying. Hitler, of course, rejected that completely and wouldn't have anything to do with it. But there was a tremendous Ukrainian hatred in many ways. But on the other hand, there were many Ukrainians who fought for and very bravely for the Red Army. So one mustn't sort of generalize too much in that particular way. I don't think that the Second World War had that much effect in that particular way. But what, of course, is there was a period when, if you like, there was a sort of an extreme version of Ukrainian nationalism which developed based on the Ukrainian nationalism of Bandera, who was both anti-Soviet and anti-Nazi and fought both sides, and of course was treated entirely as a Nazi by the communists. But I don't think that actually has had a real effect in the present events. In fact, the very pressure being put on Ukraine over the last few years by the Putin government has actually been the creation, if you like, of a real Ukraine in the sense which is both German and Ukrainian, both Russian and Ukrainian. I mean, many of the Russian speakers are not supporters of Putin. In Odessa, for example, which is much more of a Russian city than a Ukrainian city, they're preparing to defend it to the very end. There's a disbelief amongst the Russian speakers within Ukraine that they could be treated in the way that they are, being accused of being fascists and being led by a Jew who they all admire. And yet they're being told that that they must be fascists. So from that point of view, I think that they've sort of pushed back the memory of the war in many ways, of the Second World War, and they're very much more focusing on recent years and this real appreciation of Ukrainian identity.
This next question kind of leads into the last bit that you had mentioned. It's from Kostan. Is it valid to see Putin and Hitler's goals as similar in this current Ukrainian crisis?
Well, there are some very distorted echoes here. There's no doubt about it. There were some superficial echoes, as I mentioned, over Munich. There's this bizarre idea, and I mean, extraordinary paradoxes whereby, he's saying that, the Ukrainians are just their brothers and sisters. Yet why is he trying to kill them all? Why is he just trying to destroy this country that he says he loves? That it's part of the same spiritual dimension as Russia. He has got himself into the most appalling position because there was, if you like, his certain atavistic logic in terms of his historical view anchored in a past which nobody else really seemed to bother about to the same degree. This idea of the Great Rus and the Little Russia being part of Great Russia and all the rest of it. But for that to justify his idea that basically it must all be part of the same. I mean, I don't know whether this is propaganda or not, but I mean, it seems that they've been discovering dress uniforms ready for the triumphal march into Kiev, which they were expecting right at the beginning. And I think there's no doubt about it. The idea of sending in tanks and armored vehicles unsupported by infantry, thinking that there was just going to be a total collapse by the Ukrainians and that the whole thing would be over in a couple of days. Now, of course, the frightening thing is that the greater the mistakes that Putin has made, the bigger the disaster for Russia, the more dangerous he gets. And this is why I think we are seeing, as many people and many analysts, especially Fiona Hill and a whole lot of others, have rightly argued, we are now in a very, very dangerous position. I mean, from a world security point of view, purely because he has made such a terrifying mistake and refuses to acknowledge that that is the case.
This next question comes from Margaret. I really like this one. How do you think the increased globalization of world economies since World War II have affected or could affect the current conflict?
Well, there's no doubt about it. The integration, the globalization, if you like, of the world economy has been a very powerful effect, and as I mentioned, it's been one of the reasons why political leaders throughout the world do not really have quite the same degree of power that they have had in the past. The exceptions have tended to be China and Russia, where the dictatorship has controlled, and in the case of China, with a very successful economy, that has been a very powerful, created a very, very powerful machine. But in the case of Russia, they are extremely vulnerable, but at the same time, they will want to pull the world down with them. And we're seeing this very much at the moment over the whole question of the banning of Russian oil and the risk of gas being cut off to Europe. But I mean, the other knock-on effect, which is terrifying, of course, is going to be the food crisis, which is going to emerge, which is going to emerge very rapidly indeed, which is going to affect the whole of Africa and the Middle East, whose supplies tend to come very largely from Ukraine. And, Putin has actually inflicted a worldwide disaster, and this may be a worldwide economic disaster. In fact, it's very likely to be. But I don't see any way back. This is the real danger, and shall we say, I fear for the immediate future.
Wasn't it the oil, one of the oil embargo of the United States against Japan, which specifically is one of the key reasons why Japan decided to attack Pearl Harbor?
Exactly, exactly.
Next question comes from Phil. He says, I have enjoyed several of your books. Operation Market Garden in particular interests me. It was probably Montgomery's biggest failure. I'm curious what your thoughts on Montgomery's career. You touched a little bit about this already, but how was it? Why was Market Garden? Why did it more negatively affect and impact Montgomery? And he mentions that the American parallel might be Admiral Halsey's actions in Leyte Gulf.
I'm not sure about that, Hassan. I mean, Monty was responsible for Market Garden because out of sheer arrogance and determination to get ahead of the Americans, he was prepared to take risks which he would never normally have taken before. General Bradley was always very dubious about using airborne forces to get a leap forward because there was never the guarantee that you might be able to get to them in time, and they could find themselves completely cut off, and which was exactly what happened to the British Armored Division at Arnhem and Oysterberg. Monty, of course, went very quiet during Market Garden, surprise, surprise. And afterwards, it was the only time that he sort of avoided the conferences at Versailles, and he was, shall we say, rather quiet for a bit. But it was then soon when, paradoxically, when he came to the Ardennes, and of course he was thoroughly disliked by American generals for obvious reasons, Monty actually handled the counterattack in the Ardennes. I think it was one of his better operations, despite the anger of Patton and Bradley and the others, because they actually could have messed it up easily out of sheer impatience. And Monty, for once, I think, was right there. But then, of course, he wrecked everything by his boasting afterwards, implying that he'd won the whole of the Battle of Ardennes single-handed, which was so outrageous that, you know, even Brooke and Churchill were appalled and embarrassed at what he'd said.
One more question, and that question is, because we started with this, you have mentioned the shadow of history, you have mentioned the echoes of history, and that leads into this last question. In your view, what events during the Second World War have cast the longest shadow on humanity and current events?
I would have said probably the dehumanization of the enemy. I think that was the one which killed the most people, let's face it. Apart from when one thinks that Hitler was prepared to starve 30 million Soviet citizens to death, which would actually put the Holocaust in the shade. Stalin equally was prepared to kill, I mean, leaving aside the whole question of class genocide, his sacrifice of human beings was simply without any pity whatsoever. And it was, I think, that lack of humanity. It did, if you like, cause a counter effect afterwards. I think that the horrors of the Second World War were such that it, shall we say, boosted the liberal humanistic order for decades to come afterwards, to such a degree that Germany became completely pacifist. I mean, it was only 2 years ago that a Pew report showed that only 34% of Germans actually supported Article 5 of NATO. So we found that there was Germany had become, you know, virtually a completely pacifist country. The Bundeswehr was suffering from lack of spares. The Greeks had more Leopard tanks than Germany. And now, in a sudden moment, we are seeing this turnaround whereby Germany is becoming shall we say, an armed state again. realizing that it is absolutely essential because we're back almost in the same period of danger that we saw at the beginning of the Second World War. So from that point of view, I think we have recognized that that sort of cozy period of peace, which lasted for so long, cannot be counted on any longer. And I think the world has woken up.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time and very much appreciate that you agreeing to do this lecture. I know that you have another book coming out soon. I've been reading the advanced copy. It's fantastic. And I'm hoping that we can have you back to talk about the Russian Civil War. And to close the show, Gleaves, all yours, sir.
Thank you, Sir Antony, for your insightful presentation that deepens our knowledge of the Second World War and all the ways it continues to impact us some 8 decades later. And I'm glad the word Ukraine came into the narrative today. I thought it was very important and appropriate. A shout out also to our sponsors and to my good colleagues, Brooke Clement, Joel Westfall, great job as an interlocutor, and behind the scenes as ever, Kristen Phillips and Lauren Velting for making today's program a success. Programs like the one you just saw with Sir Antony are what make the Ford a very special place. If your mind was enriched, if your perspective was challenged, then we hosted a successful event, and we hope you will follow up by visiting the outstanding collections in the Ford Presidential Library in Ann Arbor and the illuminating exhibits in the Ford Presidential Museum in Grand Rapids. Also, please consider becoming a friend of Ford and help support our efforts. To sign up and see our upcoming programs and exhibits, including the very special Sistine Chapel exhibit, which is coming May 20th, visit our website, which will appear on your screen in just a moment. There you will find an array of resources to learn more about our 38th president and his virtue-anchored leadership, which is very much needed these days in America and beyond. Thank you for joining us in the important work we do. I'm Gleaves Whitney, Executive Director of the Ford Presidential Foundation, wishing you a good day.